the Subcommittee on Europe of the House Foreign Affairs Committee will come to order. The purpose of this hearing is to discuss U.S. policy in the Western Balkans and to hear from the administration on the latest issues in the region. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. 3 decades of U.S. diplomatic and economic investments in the Western Balkans have contributed to greater stability, forward movement on Euro-Atlantic integration, and economic growth. However, the Biden administration needs to fundamentally rethink its approach if it hopes to lock in the region's Western trajectory, push back against the malign influence of Russia, China, and corrupt local actors, and ensure desperately needed internal reforms are made. In particular, 2 critical pillars of U.S. Western Balkan strategy are in crisis mode: and the normalization of relations between Kosovo and Serbia, and the protection of the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and multi-ethnic character of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The European Union has an important role to play in the region, yet to date, EU efforts have been complicated by the need for unanimity in most of its foreign policy decision-making, the slow-moving EU accession process, and the fact that 5 of its member states do not recognize Kosovo. Therefore, it is incumbent upon the United States to take a leading role in the Western Balkans. The last administration understood the importance of a U.S. leadership in the region. This hearing provides an opportunity to ensure that the Biden administration is similarly invested and to conduct congressional oversight of its approach to pursue peace, prosperity, and stability in the region. There is no single issue holding back the Western Balkans more than the failure to normalize relations between Serbia and Kosovo. Under this administration's watch, recent violent protests in northern Kosovo threatened an escalation which could have engulfed the entire region. The bottom line is the current U.S. approach is failing to keep a lid on ethnic tensions and instability. Kosovo Prime Minister Albin Kurti's uncoordinated action using the Kosovo Special Police Force to install local mayors, despite being democratically elected, was imprudent and destabilizing. However, subsequent violence committed by Kosovo Serb protesters, which led to dozens of serious injuries among KFOR peacekeepers, must also be condemned, as should any direct or indirect role Belgrade played in organizing and arming those protests. I am concerned that this administration failed to speak clearly about the latter. I welcome last week's announcement that Kosovo would take some initial de-escalation steps. In particular, the President of Kosovo's militarized special police forces must be withdrawn from Serb-majority areas. However, as the U.S. keeps up pressure on Prime Minister Kurti, I strongly urge the administration to also engage Kosovo Serbs and Belgrade to ensure new local elections will not once again be boycotted. I share this administration's concern that Kosovo has not implemented an association of Serb-majority municipalities as it committed to do so a decade ago. The rights and concerns of Kosovo Serbs must be safeguarded as these municipalities are more deeply integrated into Kosovo. However, I also want to hear a commitment today from our witness that the U.S. and EU's pressure campaign to push Prime Minister Kurti on an ASM is being matched by assurances that if Kosovo engages credibly, the U.S. will exert the exact same pressure on Belgrade, not only to do the same, but also uphold its obligations under recent agreements, including its pledge not to object to Kosovo's membership in any international organization. I do not see any other way to ensure the implementation of an ASM safeguards Kosovo Serbs' rights without undermining the Kosovo government's authority over its own sovereign territory. Given the difficulties moving forward on normalization talks, the prior administration rightfully diagnosed that making progress on outstanding economic and technical issues between Kosovo and Serbia in the 2020 Washington Agreement could potentially lay the groundwork to address thornier political issues. I was very disappointed when their plan to establish a DFC presence in Belgrade was scrapped by this administration. I hope to hear more today about how the U.S. is promoting economic development and U.S. investment across the region. We cannot lose sight of the fact that despite disagreements with the current government's approach to Serbia, Kosovo is an important U.S. partner. For example, Kosovo is one of the first U.S. partners to offer to temporarily host evacuees from Afghanistan in 2021, Serbia, too, is a critical partner in the region. While it hasn't imposed EU sanctions on Russia, I am thankful for its support for Ukraine at the UN and its decision to take in thousands of Ukrainian refugees. Yet this administration must be clear-eyed in our engagement with Belgrade. The recent U.S. decision to sanction pro-Russian spy chief Alexander Vulin is a reminder that malign actors continue to exercise Russian influence in Serbia. The U.S. cannot let up pressure on either Russian or PRC inroads in Serbia, as both will threaten the country's stability, prosperity, and Euro-Atlantic integration. Sadly, these threats to peace and stability are also increasing elsewhere in the Western Balkans. Milorad Dodik's secessionist policies and assault on the authority of Bosnia and Herzegovina's constitutional court seriously undermines the Dayton Agreement. Unfortunately, this grave threat to peace has not been met by a serious U.S. response. In particular, more sanctions are needed now. We also are eagerly awaiting the formation of a new government in Montenegro. The new governing coalition will have high expectations to fight back against entrenched corruption and organized crime, accelerate Montenegro's EU ambitions, and counter foreign malign influence. In North Macedonia and Albania, the international reforms required for EU membership must continue to receive high-level U.S. support. America's security is inextricably tied to Europe's security, and Europe cannot be secure if instability in the Western Balkans is allowed to boil over. This will take real American leadership unless we allow Russia, China, and corrupt local actors to fill their vacuum and undo the last 3 decades of progress. I now recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Keating, for any statement that he may have.
Well, thank you, Chairman Kane, for holding what's an important hearing. And thank you, Deputy Assistant Secretary Escobar, for returning to the subcommittee to discuss U.S. policy towards the Western Balkans, a dynamic and diverse region in Europe. Mr. Escobar, I want to begin by thanking you for your personal commitment to the region and the effort you and the administration have taken to support peace and stability. Under your leadership, the Biden administration has worked to take a more active but also nuanced approach to the Balkans. You and your colleagues have spent countless hours listening to the concerns and considerations of the diverse groups present in the Balkans, and I know, based on these conversations, you've often had to take tough policy decisions. Having served as both chair and now ranking member, it's clear to me that the Western Balkans is a vibrant region with incredible potential, and we must do everything in our power, along with our European partners, to support continued democratic development, rule of law, and increased protection of human rights. Yet recent tensions in the region underscore that the fragile peace established after the wars of 1990s remains tenuous. For example, the recent escalation in tensions between Serbia and Kosovo and violence in northern Kosovo have been extremely alarming. In response to these events, the United States and the European Union have spoken almost in unison, calling both Kosovo and Serbia to return to the negotiating table and take specific, concrete steps to de-escalate tensions and to avoid actions or rhetoric that would be construed as escalatory. These steps would include immediately returning to the EU-facilitated dialogue, holding new elections in northern Kosovo and encouraging full participation, the formation of an association of Serb-majority municipalities in Kosovo, resumption of efforts to recognize each other's documents and national symbols, and an end to all lobbying efforts by Serbia against Kosovo's membership in international organizations. I welcome the government of Kosovo's public acknowledgement of the need for new elections, as well as their efforts to hold structured biweekly meetings with ULEX and KFOR as appropriate to review and understand the security situation there. Finally, I believe that all of those commitments, all those who've committed to violence on May 29th should be held accountable. I call for a full judicial review of recent events. Should these specific steps be taken, I believe there's a real possibility that the path towards normalization can be resumed, a prospect that would have significant benefits to all the people in the region. On Bosnia, I welcome the EU's decision to grant candidate status in December 22, pending a significant acceleration in domestic reforms. Adopting these reforms is likely to be difficult given the current political dynamics in Bosnia, however. I would urge the administration to extend full support for the reform process while encouraging Bosnia's leaders to prioritize these reforms. Bosnia still has not adopted reforms to implement several key European Court of Human Rights rulings, some of which have been found that parts of Bosnia's constitution violates the European Convention on Human Rights. Further, I continue to be concerned by the violent, escalatory rhetoric and secessionist threats from Republika Srpska leader Milorad Dodik. Despite efforts by the Biden administration to sanction individuals actively working to undermine the Dayton Accords, realities on the ground threaten stability in Bosnia and make it susceptible to foreign malign influence. In Montenegro, I'm pleased with the outcome of recent elections and encourage the State Department to continue to support those politicians actively working to achieve EU integration for Montenegro. Taking a step back on a few broader topics, I continue to be encouraged by the progress towards greater economic integration in the region, such as the Berlin process. To that end, EU accession remains a necessity for the region, and I commend the decisions that have allowed North Macedonia and Albania to move forward with their accession process. EU membership for North Macedonia and Albania will be an added strength to our transatlantic alliance at large, and I encourage those EU states who remain in opposition to recognize these reforms and compromises in North Macedonia and Albania to make sure they recognize the actions they have taken and move the process forward. They deserve ascension. Finally, I believe we must also recognize the immense strain Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine has caused on the economies and societies in the Western Balkans. Russia's actions have resulted in increased inflation and endangered energy and security interests. And Russian malign influence has sought to exploit corruption and societal divisions in the region. Recognizing these realities, we must redouble our efforts to engage with countries of the Western Balkans, continue to encourage robust foreign direct investment from the U.S. and EU, and further strengthen our bilateral and multilateral partnerships. The time for an active U.S. engagement in the Balkans is now. I'm glad to see this administration taking concrete steps to support the de-escalation and recent tensions while prioritizing Euro-Atlantic integration. I look forward to hearing your testimony today, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Keating. I ask unanimous consent that the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Schneider, be allowed to sit on the dais and participate in today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. Other members of the subcommittee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. We are pleased to have a distinguished witness before us today on this important topic. Mr. Gabriel Escobar is Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs at the Department of State. Mr. Escobar, thank you for being here today. Your full statement will be made part of the record, and I will ask you to keep your verbal comments to 5 minutes in order to allow time for member questions. I now recognize Mr. Escobar for his opening statement. Thank you.
Chairman Kane, Ranking Member Keating, members of the committee, I appreciate your invitation to discuss the Biden administration's Western Balkan policy. Our policy is grounded on a very simple principle. The continued integration of the region into Euro-Atlantic structures strengthens Europe as a geostrategic partner, fortifies democratic governance and the rule of law, and makes these countries more secure and prosperous, and thus makes the region a better partner for the United States. The obstacles are formidable. Stalled progress on democratization, corruption, energy dependence on Russia, ethno-nationalist politics, harmful disinformation are just some of the challenges. Yet they are not insurmountable. Our engagement is focused on resolving lingering tensions that threaten regional stability and on helping these countries fight corrosive corruption and disinformation from both external and internal bad actors. Let me begin with Kosovo and Serbia. In February and March, the EU, with strong U.S. support, achieved a breakthrough agreement on the path to normalization of relations with an implementation annex. Both countries must fulfill their independent obligations under this agreement. A key element is Kosovo's obligation to establish an association of Serb majority municipalities to empower municipalities with shared interests, language, and culture to coordinate on common challenges, such as delivering public services, education, and healthcare. Kosovo and Serbia also agreed to recognize each other's documents and national symbols. But most importantly, Serbia will no longer lobby against Kosovo's international integration. Since then, there have been a series of serious tensions and unacceptable violence against KFOR, police, and journalists in northern Kosovo. In response, NATO deployed reinforcements and maintains an enhanced posture to ensure a safe and secure environment. We in the EU called for immediate de-escalation, a refocus on implementing their agreements, and to hold new municipal elections with the participation of Serbs in the north. We're urging both parties to fulfill all of their obligations, which are essential to their respective European paths. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, regrettably, Republika Srpska President Milorad Dodik remains focused on dismantling the state constitution and the Dayton Peace Agreement. Dodik's persistent secessionist and anti-democratic actions threaten the stability, security, and prosperity of Bosnia and Herzegovina and the wider region. We will continue to call out and hold accountable those who undermine the Dayton Peace Agreement or threaten the country's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and multi-ethnic character. We are also seeking to bolster Dayton, including through the European Union's U4 Althea mission, and support the Office of High Representative's use of bomb powers to counter threats to Dayton. In Montenegro, we see renewed momentum toward realizing its European future. Recent presidential and parliamentary elections were free, peaceful, and reinforced the people's desire for EU integration and for reforms to advance that goal. Both Albania and North Macedonia have opened EU accession negotiations. Both are solid partners in encouraging Serbia and Kosovo's normalization, and both are stalwart NATO allies. To further its EU aspirations, the government of North Macedonia has committed to a constitutional change to recognize its Bulgarian minority. We strongly support this difficult but necessary step. Transatlantic and European integration are essential to reducing the influence of harmful actors like Russia and the PRT that seek to destabilize the region and hinder its integration while expanding their influence. Russia is the exclusive natural gas provider to some Western Balkans countries and a serious threat to regional stability. Even as it wages a war on Ukraine, the Kremlin feeds disinformation to sow tensions. The PRT pairs insidious narratives undermining trust in the West with corrosive and trapping investment. We offer alternatives to build resilience, align critical infrastructure procurement and foreign investment with EU standards to counter disinformation and to develop clean, reliable, and affordable energy. The citizens of the Western Balkans want a better future for their children, stronger and transparent democracy, accountable governments, and greater economic prosperity and security. As we help them realize this vision, continued bipartisan congressional engagement remains invaluable. Thank you, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Escobar. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. As I said in my opening remarks, the government of Kosovo must engage on the implementation of an association of Serb-majority municipalities, as it committed to do 10 years ago. However, the U.S. must ensure that an ASM protects the rights of Kosovo Serbs without undermining Kosovo's authority over its sovereign territory. Mr. Escobar, can you publicly commit that if Prime Minister Kurti engages credibly on the implementation of an ASM, the U.S. and the EU will apply the same amount of pressure on Belgrade to respond in good faith and uphold its obligations under recent agreements?
Absolutely. The recent agreement, especially the Ohrid agreement, provides an incredible opportunity for both countries to create a peaceful and sustainable relationship between the two and open the door to greater European integration. The agreement requires Serbia to recognize Kosovo's sovereignty and territorial integrity, to recognize its national symbols, flags, government documents, diplomas, passports, license plates, ID cards, and to refrain from blocking Kosovo's integration into any international organization. From the Kosovo side, it requires Kosovo to implement its existing legal obligation to form an association of Serb-majority municipalities. We believe that both countries should immediately engage on that without preconditions, that both countries should begin the process of doing their part, not without regard to any sequencing plan that is not included in the process. So we do commit to make both sides acknowledge their existing legal obligations and to move as fast as they can, and hopefully we'd be able to make significant progress on both of those this year.
Thank you. I am very concerned about the recent violence in northern Kosovo. What additional steps must Prime Minister Kurdi take to de-escalate the situation before the U.S. and the EU remove their sanctions?
Well, first, Chairman, I wouldn't call them sanctions. I call them consequences. So the U.S. and the EU have put together a three-point plan that involves de-escalation, removal of special police, the withdrawal of protesters, and the process to create new elections with the participation of Serbs with no conditions, and then to return to the EU-facilitated dialogue. So those are the conditions. Now, we have gotten a commitment from Serbia that they would remove the protesters and that they would participate fully in the elections. We haven't fully gotten that commitment from the Kosovo side, but we do agree with Kosovo on many of the democratic standards that they would like to apply. And we do agree with Kosovo that those who attack journalists, Kosovo police, and KFOR troops should be punished. But we still would like to see greater alignment on the European facilitated plan. We'll continue to work with the government of Kosovo to try to convince them that it's in their interest to align with the U.S., the UK, NATO, the European Union, the Quint, and with North Macedonia and Albania, who are also part of this process.
Can you detail how the administration is engaging with Belgrade and Kosovo Serbs on participating in new local elections you just said?
Well, first of all, I want to be very clear that in the process of the democratic development of Kosovo, we have sided with Kosovo at every opportunity. So we recognize the need for new elections, despite Serbia's objections. We recognize the legitimacy of the elections, despite Serbia's objections that the turnout was too low. We recognized the authority of the mayors, despite Serbia's objection. What our singular request was that Kosovo not try to install the mayors by force where there were protests occurring. That didn't diminish Kosovo's legitimacy or authority. But in the meantime, we have been very tough with Serbia on the conditions that we require for participation in what is a democratic process in Kosovo. So we have gotten pledges that they will not oppose this, and there are consequences for Serbia should it oppose it. So we'll continue to work with the European Union to ensure that the three-point plan does get implemented.
Okay. There have recently been numerous high-profile corruption scandals in Montenegro. These include allegations that a crypto fugitive gave funds to a political campaign in exchange for favors, as well as reports of close ties between police, former government officials, and organized crime bosses revealed by Sky ECC messaging app communications. How is the U.S. helping Montenegro combat corruption and organized crime, and has corruption in Montenegro increased its vulnerability to Russian and PRC malign influence?
Well, I would start by saying that corruption is a problem throughout the region. I am pleased to hear that in my discussions with the new Montenegrin leadership, that they are committed to the fight against corruption, their EU path, which includes making significant reforms on rule of law, and their NATO path. It is true that he remains a vulnerable NATO ally, but I do think that there is overwhelming public support for fighting corruption, for being an important member of NATO, and for pursuing their European Union integration. So we will continue to finance some of the reforms. We'll continue to use our assistance money to strengthen the capacity of the police, including to investigate crypto and other complex crimes. And we continue to look at Montenegro's development as important for the rest of the region as well.
Thank you. I now recognize Ranking Member Keating for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, we've discussed the significance of this region in many respects, but how has China used the Belt and Road Initiative to influence the Western Balkans. How do they leverage their loan dependencies and debt traps for influence in that region?
Absolutely. As I said in my opening statement, China rarely exerts positive influence in the region. It provides deceptively attractive infrastructure support, mostly through non-transparent means of financing. It refuses to align on economic and social impact studies. And once it does use this debt to extract political concessions, including non-concurrence in international bodies on criticizing the activities of the PRC. So there is always a political cost to this deceptively attractive economic investment. What we have said repeatedly is that the reforms that the European Union is requesting as they join the common economic market makes things more transparent. And with that transparency, I believe that American firms can outcompete Chinese firms any day of the week.
And I was going to ask how independently or together the U.S. and the EU can counter that kind of influence. And obviously, the movement towards EU accession is one that, with rule of law issues, stability will be enticing. But could you comment a little bit more on the appetite for private investment in that area? Because in this area, like so many areas of the world, these countries want to deal with us, but we're not there. But one of the reasons we're not there is because that kind of rule of law and stability is in place. So how close are we to bigger investments in the area that I think will provide a much better alternative to the Chinese?
I agree. And look, the region is already, as you said, hungry for it. 70% of the Western Balkans is tied to the European common market. And that common market benefits us because a majority of American investment comes through European subsidiaries of American companies. So as they align closer in a regulatory and legislative manner to the European common market, it really does facilitate foreign direct investment. Prior to the COVID crisis and the current economic crisis, the Western Balkans was the fastest growing part of Europe, with enormous opportunities for energy, shipping, transportation, IT, and a host of other sectors. So we plan to be present and plan to encourage those countries to make the reforms necessary and the transparency measures necessary to attract greater Western investment.
The greater influence you mentioned from Russia is through the energy sector. An instance of U.S. involvement has been the Millennium Challenge, and with Kosovo and the investments there that are going to be spawned from that in alternative energies and renewable energies, battery storage, and other issues. What can we do, and how has the Ukraine war changed things in terms of the energy dependence in this region as it has through other parts of Europe?
Well, for one thing, the trends that we're seeing in the rest of Europe, which is a recognition that dependence on Russian energy is harmful, has permeated the thinking of the Western Balkans. So many of the countries are already making the right moves in creating sustainable, independent energy sectors. I would say that a star in this field is Albania, which will be an exporter of energy to the region very soon. So I look forward to working with the region and working with European partners, including Greece and others, to deepen the energy independence of the region.
I think this is the concrete type of approach that's the best way to counter what people like Milorad Dodik are doing with his rhetoric. Rhetoric's one thing, but action is another. So do you think this is the best way to approach a person that's been twice designated for his?
I definitely do. And it is true. Look, Russia's influence comes through manifests itself in two ways. One is through disinformation, which is a cheap political tool. But the other is through energy. They have nothing else. Russia provides no bilateral trade, no assistance, no capacity building, and no support for democratic reforms. It simply traps them into energy dependence. So the quicker that we can help the region reduce its dependence, either through LNG or through renewables, the faster we will be able to counter Russian influence in the region.
Yeah, Russia has lost more than the war in Ukraine in its influence in this region around the world. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Keating. I now recognize Ms. Wagner from Missouri.
I thank the chairman for organizing this very timely and important hearing. And Deputy Assistant Secretary Escobar, I appreciate your service and your time here today. When you last appeared before this committee over about a year and a half ago, we discussed the serious crisis facing Bosnia and Herzegovina. Today, the country is experiencing no less than an assault on its constitution and democratic institutions. Reckless secessionists like Milorad Dodik, president of Bosnia's Republika Srpska entity, and his Russian backers are counting on the United States to stand by while they undermine the region's peace and stability. As guarantor, we are the guarantor in the U.S. of the Dayton Peace Agreement that ended the horrific Bosnian War. The United States must prioritize deterring these destabilizing, destructive, and anti-democratic actors. This morning, alongside Representative Wild, Chairman Keene, and Chairman Turner, I reintroduced the Upholding the Dayton Peace Agreement Through Sanctions Act. My bipartisan bill would codify key sanctions authorities to send an unmistakable message to any actor that threatens the peace, the security, stability, or territorial integrity of Bosnia. If such destabilizing behavior is not ceased, he or she will be sanctioned, period. Peace in Bosnia came at a very steep price, and those who would threaten that hard-won peace must be held to account. Deputy Assistant Secretary Escobar, Dodik's unilateral removal of Republika Srpska's from the jurisdiction of the Constitutional Court, I think just a couple days ago, of Bosnia, is a serious escalation in his campaign against Bosnian sovereignty. He has also threatened to hold a referendum on independence by the end of the year. This would be taking a sledgehammer to the foundations of peace in the Western Balkans. How is the State Department seeking to prevent this, and how can we bring a stop to Dodik's constant assaults on the Dayton Agreement?
Well, Congresswoman, I want to start by saying I agree with absolutely every word that you've said, that his assaults on Dayton and on the constitutional order of Bosnia and Herzegovina represent not just a threat for the country, but a threat for the region.
Yes.
The United States is committed to the territorial integrity, the sovereignty, and multi-ethnic character of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And so it is our intent to use absolutely every tool that we have to prevent that from happening and to hold those that would damage the country accountable. So that includes a stronger peacekeeping force under the EUFOR Althea mission.
Okay.
The full support for the High Representative and his use of bond powers. And we are coordinating with the European Union, with the EBRD, IMF, and other international actors to withhold money from those who would damage the country. But most importantly, we see sanctions as a very effective and very important tool in our foreign policy toolbox.
And you would agree my piece of legislation is timely and necessary?
I would, absolutely.
Thank you.
And if I can add that we are just at the very beginning of showing what the consequences are going to be. You can count on an American reaction to all of these destabilizing views.
While the U.S. has sanctioned other persons in Bosnia and Herzegovina for undermining the Dayton Accords, do you assess sanctions are being used effectively to deter destabilizing behavior? And are there more individuals, obviously there have to be in Bosnia and Herzegovina, who should be sanctioned?
I agree with that. And I will say that they are effective. They have been, there are two metrics that I can tell you that are effective. One is that in private conversations, the one thing that officials from Republika Srpska ask us is please, no more sanctions.
Well, I don't know what the delay is, but the time is running out, sir. It really is. The U.S. and U.K. sanctioned Dodik last year, but the EU has yet to do so. Why has the EU not sanctioned Dodik?
Well, that's a very good question. The most common answer that I hear is that the EU requires unanimous consent of all 27 member states.
Well, we've got to get Hungary on board, and I hope that we will do more to apply pressure and influence there. My time has run out, and I yield back, and I thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I now yield 5 minutes to Ms. Titus of Nevada.
Thank you. I'd like to go back to Mr. Keating's comments because I agree with them that how much of an influence China has had in the area. Over the last decade, we know they've invested some $32 billion in infrastructure, and Albania, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Serbia have all joined their Belt and Road initiative. So there's no question that they're there, and if they make these offers that are too hard to turn down if we're not there with some investment ourselves. But what's happening with the Russian influence seems to be more insidious, and we see that through disinformation. I understand the energy question, but the disinformation question is harder to get at, I think. We certainly saw it when North Macedonia was having the referendum to change the name in Greece and Macedonia and accept that so they can move to the West. Russia didn't like seeing them move to the West, moving along that path to EU membership, so they were in there with a good bit of information. Could you talk a little bit more about how that works in some of these other countries?
Well, look, I think that disinformation is a very cheap tool for Russia. And it does seek exclusively to create interethnic tensions and doubt about these countries' commitment to European integration. So what we have sought to do is to work with governments to, first of all, identify the outlets for disinformation, to look for ways to shut down outlets that are purely propaganda and not necessarily have any journalistic value at all. We have also looked to use our sanctions authority for people whose sole purpose is to create disinformation in the region on behalf of Russia. And so we'll continue to work with governments. Now, the most important thing is that we need partners to call it out. And I would say that overwhelmingly, particularly in the countries that are NATO members in the Western Balkans, we've had a very good level of success in pushing back on Russian disinformation.
Well, how would you comment on the status of free press in these countries?
I would say that to varying degrees, it's challenging. Mm-hmm. That international organizations have said that there is still far too much pressure, financial, personal, and legal, on some of the independent outlets in the region. I would say the protection of journalists in the region lags far behind the rest of Europe. And part of the requirements for European accession is about free press, is about protection of not just independent journalism, but civil society as well. And we stand side by side with our European partners to hold governments to account on that.
I serve on the HDP, House Democracy Partnership, and we have exchanges with a number of these countries. And of course, the problem of corruption and rule of law, those are certainly some of the barriers standing in the way to moving along this path to accession. But one of the problems is every time we go to visit, it's a whole new group of people. And you don't have established parties, you often have associations of personality. So I just wonder, how are you dealing with that lack of institutional stability to help move away from some of this disinformation or more towards the West?
Well, in general, one of the reasons why one of the pillars of our policy in the region is European integration is that it is about creating sustainable and durable institutions. So we are working to create institutions. We are also doing it bilaterally through USAID to create not only to help finance civil society, which will be the continuity on some of this, but also to create independent institutions, independent judiciary, and independent ombudsman offices that will help us, that will be long-term partners in this process.
Just finally, I know Greece is not part of your domain or bailiwick or jurisdiction, but I don't see how you can make policy in the Western Balkans without Greece being a big part of that. Certainly in the development of energy, we see that now. And even as in the whole situation with the Macedonian name, Greece has got to be a big player in everything done here.
Greece is an example, at least in Kosovo, that not all non-recognizers are adversaries. I do engage the Greek government frequently. They are helpful. They are an integral part of bringing stability to the region politically, but also they are one of the leading countries that are moving to help diversify the energy picture in the Western Balkans. So I do engage with Greece, and Greece is absolutely indispensable, as is Austria, as is Slovenia and others.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Tice. And I recognize Mr. Heisinger of Michigan for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Mr. Escobar. Serbia has imported arms from China, including drones, according to reports. How does this affect Serbia's aspirations to join the EU, given the EU's arms embargo against the PRC?
I would say that it challenges it. Now, there are some technical complications here. Now, one of the discussions that we have with Serbia is that the CATSA sanctions prevent them from buying Russian weaponry, and they have dramatically decreased their procurement from Russia. But in doing so,
So not just China, but Russia.
right, but they've increased from China, which is not limited by any of our sanctions regimes. We have said that if they do truly want to be part of the Euro-Atlantic community, that they should show it in part through their military procurement. So we would like to see greater engagement from European and American companies in that vein. That said, we also want to be very careful about our existing policy that supports Kosovo as we do so. So we would like to see a comprehensive discussion on how Serbia should be behaving in the region.
My understanding is it's something like 30 tanks and 30 armored personnel carriers have been purchased from Russia. We've also purchased some air defense systems as well as attack transport helicopters. Has it been communicated to Belgrade that the U.S. could respond to significant purchases of Russian military equipment?
Absolutely.
With those mandatory sanctions?
Absolutely, absolutely. We have given them
And
some work.
what's their response been?
Their response is they understand and they are adapting. Now,
And I'm sorry, they're what?
they are adapting their procurement
Adapting.
strategy.
Meaning they're
on that.
stopping?
I would say that they have curtailed it significantly as a result
Okay,
of our
so not
discussions.
stopping, but maybe curbing their purchasing.
It is a complicated procurement process that involves
Yeah.
that involves what they are buying.
Sanctions are complicated. I sit
No,
on the
well,
Financial Services Committee where most of those
Yeah.
sanctions run through. And
Right.
But pretty typically, either that switch is thrown on or off. So
That's right. And so, look, there are some challenges when you're talking about existing contracts that require logistical support for already purchased weapon systems.
So fair to say we have warned Belgrade that
Very forcefully so, sir.
I'm glad to hear that. Along that vein, you had mentioned Kosovo and advocating for Kosovo, and I see we've got the ambassador is here in the audience as well. 5 member states of the EU, Spain, Greece, Romania, Cyprus, and Slovakia, currently do not recognize Kosovo's independence. This would seem to be a serious obstacle for Kosovo and the Euro-Atlantic integration. How is State Department engaging with these countries to urge them to recognize Kosovo?
Well, I have permanent contact with all 5 of those countries. Now, one of the things that they do want, and one of the things that I have been trying to convince the government of Kosovo, is they want to see a European process in order to satisfy their requirements under their own laws and under their own national legislation to be able to recognize. Now, it's our position that
Meaning what exactly?
Well, I'll say that from our perspective, it is our highest aspiration that Kosovo will be a member of NATO, a member of the European Union, and have a seat at the United Nations. Now, for some of the countries, they cannot recognize absent a bilateral agreement between Serbia and Kosovo. For others, they don't recognize unilateral declarations of independence, so they'd like to see an agreement on normalization. This is one of the reasons why the Ohrid Agreement offers us the greatest opportunity in 15 years to partner with the government of Kosovo to begin not just a regional or European recognition campaign, but a global recognition campaign. Now, what most of these countries would like to see is they would like to see the goodwill from Kosovo in fulfilling its part of the agreement, which is the Association of Serb majority municipalities. So one of the reasons why I've encouraged the government of Kosovo to go ahead and move forward on this with American support in a way that ensures that the ASM does not violate their constitution, their legal structure, or their functionality, so that we can move forward this year on a recognition campaign. To date, I have not gotten that alignment from the government of Kosovo.
All right. My last remaining few seconds here. Is the Biden administration planning to continue to use sanctions to address Russian influence networks in Siberia as well as across that Western Baltic region?
Yes.
Okay. And maybe we'll follow up with a how. I wish I had more time for the how. That is actually the important part. So with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Heisinger. I now recognize Mr. Costa of California for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this is an important hearing, and let me follow up with my colleague's last question and ask you the how.
Well, will say that on sanctions on Russia, we're constantly looking for ways to limit Russia's malign influence everywhere we see it, including the Arctic region, including the Baltics, including the Balkans. And so the sanctions part is a really important part of it. The energy diversity part is very important. I have to say that in the past year and a half, since the beginning of the unprovoked aggression by Russia on Ukraine, we have seen a tremendous convergence with our European partners on the need to limit Russia's ability to do harm in this world.
No, and that's true, but as noted before, sanctions can be effective or complicated, and of course, notwithstanding probably the most severe sanctions that Russia's ever felt, they still are able to find workarounds, and therefore we must constantly be on it. We need our European allies, obviously, at the same time to ensure, I mean, the amount of fuel, of energy that Russia's still managing to sell is financing their war and continuing to get their economy, maintain their economy in ways that we had hoped it would not be. You talked more on the issue in Kosovo and Serbia and the trajectory on your comprehensive normalization efforts, and you have these conditions that have been stated, and you know, that was back in March, I guess, of '23, and the acceptance of the implementation annex, and both the EU and we view these as being legally binding, as I understand it. So when you look at the 5 bullets, so the parties agreed to establish good neighbor relations, the parties agreed to mutually recognize respective national symbols and documents. Serbia will not object to Kosovo's membership in any international organizations, and to work toward implementing the ASM and the agreement. Where are we on these 5 bullets? Because I think we're now in July, and what do you see the prospects of successful implementation and agreement before the end of the year? And who's, you know, I mean, who needs the most prodding and pushing in this instance?
Well, I would say I don't see a lot of goodwill on either side to implement that agreement. We have tried repeatedly on both sides to make movement, and in the meantime, what we've seen is a series of escalating tensions in the region.
And finger pointing.
And finger pointing. So our position is that the agreement was immediately implementable upon agreement. And so each side had to map out a way in which they were going to do their part. So for Serbia, it'll require entering into legislation the recognition of Kosovo's national symbols and all of the other elements that I talked about before. And for the Kosovo side, it was the immediate work on the draft statute of the association of Serb majority municipalities. To date, we've seen neither party move forward on that.
And so are these negotiations continuing with both ourselves and the EU sitting down with both these parties across the table to create some level of momentum?
Yes. Unfortunately, over the last 60 days, what we've seen, what we've had to focus our attention on is preventing the violence in the north from spreading even further and from destabilizing the region. But that was the point of the EU three-point plan on de-escalation, which we support.
Well, and Serbia's, or Russia's influence in Serbia obviously isn't helping.
It is not helping, but I will tell you that in much of this, it's not so much a bilateral issue as a failure of ethnic reconciliation inside of the country as well. So
Well, the ethnic recognition goes back
it goes back a long
hundreds of years. I mean,
I would say not as far, but in much of it is regional, because if that were the case, the entire region would be embroiled in ethnic rivalry. And I'll say that right now we have a two-track Balkans. We have those that are NATO members that are actively contributing to regional stability, and not surprisingly, those are the ones that have.
before my time is what are the efforts in the Western Balkans taken to respond to the rising white nationalism and anti-Semitism across Europe?
We are working very hard. We call it out wherever we see it. We have a part of the reform process is the protection of minorities, and it is the fight against harmful and fascist rhetoric as well.
All right, my time's expired, but to be continued. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Costa. I now recognize the Vice Chair of the committee, Mr. Self, from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My history, I traveled extensively through Bosnia, Herzegovina when I was in NATO, built the forces to go there, the combined forces, international forces, and the force to go to Kosovo. I've actually been in Belgrade to see the bomb damage that we inflicted with a Tomahawk into the MOD building, which they kept for whatever reason. I hear some internal disconsonance in your testimony in this discussion. You said we have sided with Kosovo at every turn. I think you since have backtracked on that to a more balanced approach, but I don't think there is any doubt that Vučić incited the boycott of the Kosovo elections. There can be no doubt of that. What I'm less certain of is that Serbia delayed their own elections based on the Kosovo elections. I want to point out to people, and I hopefully will get to a question. This is not Ukraine, which is on the edge of NATO. This is Serbia and Russia surrounded by NATO nations. This is potentially more dangerous than Ukraine to NATO should this violence spread. I'm uncertain as to why we don't have sanctions on Serbia now, because they have imported heavy weapons from Russia since 2017, which should have led to sanctions under something called the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act in 2017. We'll stop there and ask you why not.
Well, I'll tell you that on the sanctions question, it is not my office that deals with the sanctions question, but I do understand the process. The CATSA sanctions are not merely about purchasing Russian weapons. If that were the case, we might have a problem with India, Turkey, and others. And so really it is about the level of purchase and the technological capability of the purchases. That is why we have continually had this discussion with Serbia about the risk that they are taking from.
Well, let me ask you that. Let's follow up on that point.
Yeah.
Do you have discretion on sanctions? Would those sanctions not help with what you are trying to achieve, where implementation of the agreement?
Where we have the greatest leverage, or the greatest flexibility, is on Western Balkan sanctions, to sanction those who undermine regional stability. And we have used those liberally, and for corruption. And we have used those extensively as well. CATSA is a different issue because it is a different office. And it is really a question of sanctions that are aligned with our Russia policy, which I don't deal with.
Okay.
But I'm happy to take that question back.
Very good. In the interest of time, I was kind of surprised to see that Elliot Engel, a colleague from across the aisle who used to chair this committee, just wrote a piece on Serbia and Russia, and he reached the conclusion. Now, remember, he is a colleague from across the aisle who used to chair this committee that reached the conclusion that the Biden administration is appeasing Serbia. Any comments on you as a Biden administration official?
I would say that's factually wrong. So in the last 60 days, everything that we have done has prejudiced Serbia. We were in favor of visa liberalization for Kosovo, Council of Europe membership for Kosovo. We were in favor of supporting their elections over Serbia's objections. We recognize the results of the elections, even with a 3% turnout, over the objections of Serbia. We recognize the authority of the mayors over the objections of Serbia. We have sanctioned their intel chief. So
But you're also supporting new elections. And in a previous hearing, I made the point that when we have a low turnout in the U.S., which we often do, we don't ask for new elections. And yet you have joined the EU in calling for new elections, have you not?
We have. In fact, the government of Kosovo itself has said that these elections are not a key to stability. Because
So is that not an indication that Kosovo is willing to work with Serbia?
that is. No, we'd like to move forward on that part as well. So we have a commitment from both sides. We have a commitment from Kosovo that they would welcome new elections. They see that having ethnic Albanian mayors in predominantly Serb municipalities, with in some cases, some of the municipal members had only a single vote, their own. That is not a recipe for stability. So
I understand.
we're working with both sides.
My time is up, so I just ask you, do not let this Russian proxy inside NATO territory get a toehold. Thank you, sir. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Self. I now recognize Mr. Moran for 5 minutes.
Secretary Escobar, thank you for your time today. I want to talk to you a little bit about Montenegro. As you know, China has spent a lot of time and a lot of money through its Belts and Road initiative in the Balkans, and they have, in particularly back in 2014, invested about $1 billion with Montenegro for a major highway system there. That's about 20% of the GDP of Montenegro, and the principal cost of that is just enormous to me as I think about their total GDP. Do you know what progress Montenegro has made in paying off this significant debt to China?
Well, look, I don't know all the details, but I do know that the former Minister of Finance did a really good job of refinancing with international assistance some of that debt to lower the interest rate and to lower the debt load. But we agree, and unfortunately for Montenegro, we use the example of that road as an example of the malign debt trap that China uses to pressure countries in the region.
Yeah, that's why it surprised me that in March of this year, it looked like that Montenegro signed another MOU for China to do some additional investment for another road through its Belts and Road initiative. Is my understanding correct?
I think it's the same road, sir.
Same road. Are they doing more financing, or is it a refinancing? What happened in March of this year?
Unfortunately, I don't know the details of that. I'll have to take that back and get back to you on that.
When you say that the international community stepped in and it helped with some of the terms of the financing, is China still the principal creditor behind the financing?
Oh, no, I didn't say that we stepped in. I said that.
No, I said the international community. You said, you
Right.
mentioned that somebody in the international.
That's right, the international community. I believe it was through international lenders, but that was not through the U.S. government.
But is China still the principal creditor, or has somebody else stepped in the middle of that as the new creditor?
For that road, I believe they still are, but again, I don't know the full details of that. Now, if I can say one thing about Montenegro, the recent presidential and parliamentary elections are poised to make Montenegro one of the fastest achieving candidates for European Union membership. So I'm very confident that the new leadership of Montenegro is taking it in the right direction, and that they are very clear about how they see Chinese investment.
Yeah, in April of 2023, Jakov Militovic was elected and supplanted the prior leader of Montenegro, and that was good news because it looks like that the new leader is more pro-American than his predecessor. Is that your understanding as well?
Well, I would say they were equally pro-American, but I would say that it was a welcome transition. The previous president had been in power for over 30 years, nonstop. So this democratic transition is exactly what we're looking for from from aspirant countries in the region. So I hold out a lot of hope for the future of Montenegro.
Do you know why the country of Montenegro sought out this financing originally in 2014 and continues to look towards China for assistance in its infrastructure? Is it because it has no other place to go? Is the U.S. stepping in to try to assist? Give me the sense of why they're going that direction.
I would say that it is consistent with a lot of the patterns that we've seen in the Western Balkans, which is deceptively cheap infrastructure projects that come with built-in financing. I believe that the United States and Europe has to figure out the financing piece. And that'll be important for small countries like Montenegro and others in the region.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. So tell me, what are your thoughts specifically on how we do that? How do we get ourselves between China and these smaller countries that are seeking infrastructure investment?
Well, we see DFC as an important part of that, and we'd like to see a more active presence of DFC in the region.
Does DFC allow us to invest in countries for national strategic purposes in addition to qualification on economic bases?
I can't speak on behalf of another agency, but I do certainly hope and I do believe that they have the same strategic vision and aspiration that we do.
All right. I'll use the remaining of my time just to reinforce that I think it's imperative for us to do, as you have mentioned, get between China and some of these smaller countries across the world, including the Balkans, and to make sure that we are not allowing them to become financially captive to China so that they are no longer influenced by China for their foreign policy, their economic policy, and frankly, their military policy. Appreciate your time. I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moran. I now recognize Mr. Issa from California for 5 minutes.
Thank you. With no disrespect to our witness, it should be noted that this is an unusual situation in which we are hearing from the administration, but we're not hearing from the parties, who I believe would be able to give us a lot more insight into some of the instability in the regions and the causes. And this is particularly true in northern provinces of Kosovo. Albeit a small population, it's still a population needs to be resolved, and I'll ask about that later. My first question is, the Prime Minister's unilateralism is well documented and is a major obstacle to progress. What and how should we be dealing with, quite frankly, a head of state who is not part of the solution?
Well, I would say, to begin with, we have made our requests very public and very clear. The European Union, for its part, has imposed consequences, and we have as well. We withdrew Kosovo from a major international military exercise as a result of the unilateralism. And we continue to look for ways to partner with what is one of our closest allies in the region. I do have to say that we are concerned about the lack of alignment that Kosovo has, not with the United States, but with the entire transatlantic community. So that includes the UK, the European Union, NATO, the Quint, and its neighbors, Albania and North Macedonia. So we are looking actively for ways that we can convince the government to see the United States, again, as its primary partner in the region, and that alignment with the United States only benefits Kosovo, doesn't detract from its aspirations.
And following up on United States being primary historically, it certainly is fair to say that in many ways the United States is taking a backseat to the European Union on many of these issues. Can you describe what the benefits are of a lesser involvement, lesser engagement, and letting the European Union have, if you will, the front seat?
Well, first of all, I respectfully disagree that we've taken
I thought you would.
a backseat. But, you know, it's important that the European process be the face of our transatlantic engagement. The challenge for Kosovo to be a part of NATO and a part of the European Union is it runs through 5 non-recognizers. So we need a European path that the European non-recognizers understand and accept as the basis for their foreign policy decisions. However, we are very, very firmly in support of that process. We bring the 2 parties together. We support every outcome financially, politically, and through capacity building, and we'll continue to do so. And in the meantime, we are one of the primary guarantors of a safe and secure environment in Kosovo through our contributions to the NATO peacekeeping force in Kosovo. So we are very involved and very engaged in this process.
Following up on very involved and very engaged, and recognizing that I'm not asking for unreasonable risk, but State Department, by definition, takes risk in every place they go, particularly in areas of conflict. It is my understanding that we have not had U.S. Diplomats in North Kosovo to meet with the parties there in, if you will, any reasonable time in the last year. Can you explain how the meeting elsewhere is the equivalent of going to the region and meeting there?
Well, again, I respectfully disagree. I personally travel to Mitrovica almost every time I go. I talked to...
When was the last time you were in North Kosovo?
The last time I was in North Kosovo was in the fall of last year. Now, since then, I've been with leaders of Kosovo, including Serb leaders in other parts of Kosovo and other parts of the region. I speak to the leader of Srpska Lista on a regular basis. And as we speak, we have a group of Kosovo Serb civil society leaders here in town, and they are having contacts with people on the Hill as well. So we have significant contact with Kosovo Serbs.
Lastly, I just want to slip in one last question, if you don't mind. Do you believe that there is a constitutional way to resolve this multi-ethnic problem in a way that keeps a united Kosovo?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that the association would do that. On one hand, it would allow Serbs to exercise their rights of self-governance, as was envisioned under the Ahtisaari Plan, as is required by the Brussels Agreement, the Ohrid Agreement, and the European Council conclusions, but also takes into account the fact that these people are also dual citizens. So there are European models that we can implement if we have the goodwill of the parties.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Issa. I now yield to Mr. Lawler for 5 minutes of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been over a decade since the 2013 Brussels Agreement, and progress between Serbia and Kosovo on normalizing relations is clearly stalled. Is it time to reopen this agreement and think anew?
No, I would say no. I think it's a good agreement. It's a valid agreement, and it is the basis for the Ohrid Agreement, which creates real possibilities for both countries to integrate closer to the European Union and to create a peaceful and sustainable relationship between the two. What we need from both sides is to rise above the politics of ethnic rivalry, populism, and ethno-nationalism, and look at the real opportunities of joining a union where they'll be forced to live not just with people of their own ethnicity, but people of all ethnicities in the European Union. So that's what we need, is we need some political courage on both sides.
I'm certainly sympathetic to Pristina's concerns that the Association for Serb Majority Municipalities could be manipulated by Belgrade as a lever of influence. As the administration tried to instead develop a new construct which would protect ethnic minorities, specifically the Kosovo Serbs, in Kosovo without undermining Kosovo's sovereignty over northern Kosovo?
That is our stated policy. In fact, the Secretary's counselor, Derek Chalet, and I published an op-ed in Kosovo outlining that any such association should not undermine Kosovo's constitutional authority, its legal structure, or its functionality. That it really would be about delivering, effectively delivering services, municipal services in Serbian language to a population that speaks Serbian. That's really what it is, and nothing more. So we have been, we had offered, in fact, Albania has offered to help draft that statute. And we are hoping that Kosovo will understand that it has an obligation, and while it fulfills that obligation, it should be in line with European standards.
5 member states of the European Union, Spain, Greece, Romania, Cyprus, and Slovakia, currently do not recognize Kosovo's independence. This is a serious obstacle to Kosovo's Euro-Atlantic integration. How is the State Department engaging with these countries to urge them to recognize Kosovo and then begin the conversations about EU and NATO membership?
Well, first of all, we have had these conversations not just with the 5 non-recognizers in Europe, but other non-recognizers around the world. The main obstacle for many of the countries is they believe that unilateral independence creates instability and not stability. For some, there are constitutional requirements that it be a bilateral agreement. This is one of the reasons why the Ohrid Agreement, which was brokered by the European Union and monitored by the European Union under European standards, gives us the greatest opportunity to advance that cause in the last 15 years. So as we've done that, we've started to explore that not only with the 5 non-recognizers, but with NATO and the European Union as well, to look for ways to foster development, integration of Kosovo into those structures. Now, the one thing that I hear back almost unanimously is that they're waiting to see goodwill from Kosovo on the implementation of the ASM.
Okay. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Lawler. I now recognize Mr. Schneider of Illinois for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm grateful for the chance to be here. Deputy Assistant Escobar, it's good to see you again. Thank you. And thank you for your patience. And as always, it's grateful for you sharing your sister with us.
Thank you.
She's wonderful to work with. There's been a very important hearing so far. And the Western Balkans effectively form an island surrounded by NATO and the European Union. And our role has to be to work with our European allies to facilitate a future in which all the nations, religions, and ethnicities of the Western Balkans can live side by side in peace and prosperity. We know it's not an easy task, and I like the last paragraph of your opening statement, I think said it beautifully, but we have to make sure that the citizens of the Western Balkans are able to see a future for their children and are fully invested in it. You started to talk earlier and ran out of time. I want to give you a chance. You mentioned the two-track Balkans.
That's
Can you
right.
expand on that?
Yeah. Well, look, we have, it would be a mistake to look at the Balkans as a single unit. What we have is we have 3 countries in the Western Balkans who have advanced their European candidacy the fastest, who are not coincidentally members of NATO. They have been very instrumental in supporting our efforts to create regional stability, and not just regional stability, but European stability, and that is Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Albania. And we work very closely with them. North Macedonia in particular was extremely helpful in helping us reach the Ohrid Agreement. So we count on those 3 countries to help extend our reach into the other 3. Now, we have 3 others, Serbia, Kosovo, and Bosnia and Herzegovina, that are lagging in their efforts to integrate into the European Union. I would say that the one thing that they have in common is that they have not reached the level where the politics, domestic politics, do not depend on ethnic rivalry. So we are working with our European partners and our regional partners to find ways to create interethnic reconciliation and regional integration. And I would say that without those three members, we would be much further behind than we are now.
Let me build on that a little bit. You know, ethnic groups often view the world as a zero-sum game. One wins, the other has to lose. Is that the case here? And if it is, are there ways we can work to demonstrate that it's not a zero-sum game, but a win-win for all players if we can find a path to bring more integration?
And that is our plan. So one is integration into the European Union. So it will be a benefit for the region. It'll be a benefit for Europe, because these countries do have enormous potential economically and socially and culturally. And that includes economic integration among the region. And so we have been supported by the three NATO countries in the Western Balkans in our efforts to promote regional economic integration, which transcends the ethnic difficulties of the region.
Great. And the other thing, the last question I'll have given the time, but you mentioned that integration is essential to reducing the influence of harmful actors. We've talked a lot about the Russians, about the PRC. You also mentioned corrupt local actors. Rather than focusing on them, I'd like to ask you, are there existing or up-and-coming benevolent or strong actors that we should be working to build relationships with, looking to reinforce and strengthen their position?
Well, yes. I mean, throughout the region, we do have very solid partners who believe in European integration and NATO engagement and the fight against corruption. And I would say that one of the bright spots of the Montenegro parliamentary and presidential elections is that overwhelmingly the winners were the ones who were focused on those three aspects of their policy.
Great. And with a few seconds left, I know in 2020, Albania hosted the Balkans Forum Against Anti-Semitism. Can you tell us a little bit about the progress in the Western Balkans in countering anti-Semitism since that forum, and what we should be doing to strengthen that going forward?
Well, I would say in Central Europe it's always a challenge, but I would say that most of the countries in the region have made progress in codifying protections for minority groups, in fighting extremism, and working with us, particularly on the anti-Semitism piece.
Great. Well, I know we have an ambassador in Deborah Lipstadt, and hopefully we can work together there. I have 7 more questions and no more time. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you again for allowing me to sit in on this hearing, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Schneider. With no further questions from the members, I want to thank our witness, Mr. Escobar, for his valuable testimony, and the members for their questions. Members of the subcommittee may have some additional written questions for the witness, and we ask that you respond to these promptly in writing. Pursuant to committee rules, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitations. Without further objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned. Thank you.